Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all for this session, which is on advancements in environmental and social policies of the European international financial institutions. So my name is Stephen O'Driscoll. I head up the Environmental, Climate and Social Office at the EIB, and I have the pleasure of chairing this event today. So this event today does in fact kickstart the European Forum, which is actually a series of 4 events led by the EIB, and that's in cooperation with our European partners from the European Commission and the EBRD. And the forum as a whole has a few parts. We'll highlight the progress in the climate, environmental and social agenda of the institutions in light of latest policy developments. We'll discuss the best practice in sustainable finance, which is a fast evolving space at the moment, and we'll foster some dialogue around the emerging issues in ESG risk management. So all very interesting areas. And today I'm very pleased to be joined by a very distinguished panel of our long-standing partners and people who are, really key players in this field. So first and foremost, I'd like to welcome Aurel Ciobanu-Dodea, who is Director of Implementation and Support to the EU Member States in DG Environment and at the European Commission.
Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Aurel is in charge of the enforcement of EU environmental legislation across the EU, and he also deals with environmental investments funded by structural funds and the RRF, and the environmental impacts of non-environmental investments. And Aurel is also responsible for environmental governance matters, including environmental impact assessments. We're also joined by Dr. Alistair Clark. Alistair's the Managing Director of Environment and Sustainability at the EBRD. And his role includes ensuring that all investments are consistent with the bank's environmental and social policy and performance requirements. And he's also responsible for providing strategic direction to the EBRD with respect to the implementation of the bank's sustainability mandate and the incorporation of environmental and social aspects in all their sector and country policies and strategies. Our next speaker then is Eva Meyerhofer, who is our lead environmental and biodiversity specialist here at the EIB. Eva leads in a number of areas for us, including supporting EU and international biodiversity policies, increasing the availability of finance to drive natural capital transformation, mainstreaming biodiversity in bank operations, and so on. So Eva is a very busy person at the moment. And last but by no means least, we have Joan Pellean, who is the team leader of the Environmental and Climate Change Mainstream Facility at the European Commission's DG International Partnership, so DG INPA. So Joan is an international expert in impact assessment and has been working on mainstreaming environment and climate change in development cooperation for over 15 years now. So in this particular session, we'll start with a short series of presentations by each of our guests, and then we'll follow that with a panel discussion. And since this session is actually being pre-recorded, we won't unfortunately have the opportunity to take any live questions from the audience, but we would actually encourage them to submit questions and comments via the IAIA platform, and we will actually do our best to try and address them after the session. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Aurel from DG Environment to set the scene. And Aurel, you're going to talk to us about the InvestEU regulation, where investments will undergo sustainability proofing to prove, if you like, their climate, social and environmental credentials and what the requirements of that proofing are. So over to you, Aurel.
Yeah, thank you very much, and hello again to everybody. I'm saying a time neutral hello for people, irrespective of their time zones, to be greeted when watching this panel. before entering into the brief presentation of the latest developments, essentially related to the InvestEU regulation, I would like to say a few words about the backdrop against which these developments take place. I won't be very long because I'm sure that this backdrop is to a large extent familiar to everybody. We all see what happens around us and what is the societal agenda and the political agenda of our days for many of the countries within the European Union, but also besides the European Union, in the United Kingdom, also in other countries. We are facing climate and environmental emergency. We see around us what is going on and how not just the climate and environment are impacted by the consequences of what happens, but there are societal and economic implications. And this makes it necessary to mobilize all the political instruments, policy instruments, and financial instruments in order to address such an emergency, which is very pervasive and has consequences on communities, on economies, on economic operators, on the level playing field from an economic perspective. And this is why there is so much political concentration over the past few years, notably since the beginning of the current Commission led by Ursula von der Leyen, its president, since the end of 2019. Many of you might be familiar with the adoption of the European Green Deal communication in December 2019, which was the first landmark political decision made by the current Commission and has laid out the climate and environmental priority as paramount for the current Commission. And when I'm speaking about the pervasiveness of the climate and environmental emergency and the problems related to the degradation of biodiversity, for instance, and the need to do as much as possible to reverse these trends, I've said that we have to mobilize not only policy instruments, but also the financial instruments in support of addressing effectively these priorities. So we have seen this with the adoption of the multi-annual financial framework, which is, to put it very schematically, about the EU budget for the next 6-7 years. But we have seen also last year the adoption of the taxonomy regulation, which is a set of rules for the sustainability proofing of investments from public funds into projects, into different areas of activity. And this is also the case with this InvestEU funding program. The legal basis of which, the regulation of which, has been adopted formally at the beginning of this year in 2021. Both the taxonomy regulation and the InvestEU regulation have defined the sustainability dimension as central to economic and financing decisions, which are made in order to allocate public or private money in different investments. The taxonomy regulation has also introduced the principle of do no significant harm, which we see echoed also in the area covered by the InvestEU regulation. and has also this same principle, do no significant harm, has inspired the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is being developed by the European Union as a major instrument, financial instrument to reignite the economics of the European Union after the shock administered by the COVID crisis and its societal and economic impacts. So this is a little bit the background against which people must understand what is going on in the framework of the Invest EU program. And let me, before moving to the first slide, say a few words about this program, which builds on a previous financial instrument which was developed already under the previous Commission. The purpose of InvestEU program is to provide long-term funding to companies which are active and want to invest in projects and areas that respond to the EU's political priorities, such as the European Green Deal, which I already mentioned, such as the digital transition, which is another major outstanding challenge and opportunity for the European Union, including also the recovery from the current pandemic crisis. And as I mentioned earlier, the InvestEU regulation has embraced also the sustainability of financing and investment operations as an important element in the decision-making process when approving the use of the EU guarantee. For the purposes of the InvestEU regulation, sustainability refers to three dimensions: climate, environmental, and social. And just to remind everyone, or to point this to the audience which is not familiar with the InvestEU program, it contains three components: the purse, or the budget, the money, which is the InvestEU fund, which aims to mobilize more than 372 billion euros of public and private investment through a new budget guarantee of 26.2 billion euros that backs the investment of implementing partners, by the implementing partners such as the European Investment Bank Group, EIB Group, the EBRD, or other financial institutions and national promotional banks. Then the second component is the advice, the advisory hub of InvestEU, which will be the central entry point for project promoters and intermediaries seeking advisory support and technical assistance related to centrally managed EU investment funds. And then you have the marketplace, or the stock exchange, where the demand meets the offer. The InvestEU portal, which brings together investors and project promoters on a single EU-wide platform by providing an easily accessible and user-friendly database of investment opportunities available within the European Union. And now I think I would be grateful if we could move to the first slide, which is about the money, the InvestEU fund. And this is where the recent development which took place, the adoption by the Commission of the guidance on sustainability proofing, this is where this guidance will apply. The sustainability proofing will apply to the investments which will be made from the fund. What will the fund finance? It will support 4 policy windows, or to use the language of the regulation, or to use a more accessible language, it will have it will support 4 major areas for investments. sustainable infrastructure, financing projects in sustainable energy, digital connectivity, transport, circular economy, water, waste, other environmental infrastructure, and so on. It will support also research, innovation, and digitalization, projects in research and innovation, taking research results to the market, digitalization of industry, scaling up larger innovative companies, artificial intelligence, and so on. It will also fund SMEs, small and medium-sized companies, facilitating access to finance for such companies, which will include capital support for SMEs that were negatively affected by the COVID-19 crisis. And last but not least, social investment and skills, funding projects in skills, education, training, social housing, schools, universities, hospitals, social innovation as well, healthcare, long-term care and accessibility, social enterprises, integration of migrants, refugees and vulnerable people, and more. I would like to also make clear that all the operations, all the projects and activities supported by the InvestEU fund will have to comply with the applicable EU and national rules. For this reason, an assessment and confirmation of legal compliance will be required for all project that will undergo approval, and this will be the first step for ensuring that the do no significant harm principle applies. In addition, operations have to be screened and assessed with respect to their climate and environmental and social costs and benefits. I would like to kindly ask to move to the next slide. Thanks a lot. A little bit of more information for the audience about the recently adopted, a little bit earlier this month in April 2021, recently adopted sustainability proofing guidance in the framework of the InvestEU program. The guidance explains how financing and investment operations under the fund are to meet the three dimensions of the sustainability commitments, climate, environmental, and social, that I mentioned a little bit earlier. It is worth recalling that this guidance incorporates the very useful experience accumulated by the Commission in the appraisal of major projects for cohesion policy or trans-European networks for transport and energy projects, and also incorporates and builds upon the experience accumulated by the international financial institutions in the due diligence procedures, for instance. So those of you in the audience who are familiar already with cohesion policy, with trans-European networks projects, with the due diligence procedures applied by international financial institutions, will encounter a familiar land, a familiar territory when you will have a look at the guidance. One last detail of some relevance. There is a 10 million euros threshold which will apply based on the size of the total investment operation, and when below these thresholds, there will be no screening or proofing required, but there is an exception. Those projects that require an environmental impact assessment under the EIA directive, for instance, and the audiences will be certainly familiar with this, Annex 1 projects or screened in Annex 2 projects, where proofing for the environmental, social, and climate dimension will be required regardless of the total project cost for the impacts identified in the EIA report and building on it. Please, can we move to the next slide? I would like to say a few words about the environmental dimension of the sustainability proofing. What does the above mean for environment, in other words? The environmental proofing means a method, or is a method, for measuring the positive and negative impacts of a project on the principal components of natural capital around us, namely air, water, land, and biodiversity, as it is required by a specific provision of the InvestEU regulation. Or to put it in simpler terms, this is the diagnostic method for estimating predictably and consistently the benefits and risks of an intended investment, of an investment which asks for money from the fund, from the purse. For projects requiring an EIA, the implementing partner, so the EIB group or the national promotional banks or EBRD and so on, will have to review the impacts and risks identified and the proposed measures to avoid, prevent, or reduce them, mitigation measures, or will have to look also at the offsetting measures, the compensation measures, likely significant negative impacts on the environment. This information will be available in the EIA report and in other documentation such as permits, additional studies, or reports from other assessments. The implementing partner will also have to review that an assessment has been carried out of the risks of any significant negative impacts remaining after mitigation, where medium risk and or high risk residual impacts have been identified in the EIA report, then the implementing partner should conduct proofing of those significant negative impacts. Where feasible, the proofing should include quantification and monetization. This further assessment could trigger additional measures as explained in the guidance, and where the residual impact has been assessed as low risk in the EIA report, no further proofing is necessary. For projects screened out with mitigation measures, the implementing partner will have to review the identified impacts and risks and the mitigation measures proposed in the screening decision and supporting documentation in order to avoid and prevent what might otherwise have been significant negative impacts on the environment. For projects screened out without mitigation measures and for projects outside the scope of the EIA directive, the implementing partner will have to, in cooperation with the project promoter, identify whether there is a need for additional studies or reports and review the impacts and risks identified in those additional studies and reports and consider possible mitigation measures to avoid or prevent what might otherwise have been significant negative impact on the environment. And lastly, for projects from all the categories three categories that I have mentioned a few moments ago, the implementing partner is strongly recommended to use the positive checklist to identify possibilities to improve the performance of the project. And the implementing partner also must report to the InvestEU Investment Committee and monitor the project. So here it is. I hope this doesn't sound like Chinese. It is in a nutshell the summary of the key obligations which are defined, key aspects which are defined by the InvestEU guidance, sustainability guidance, which was adopted. And I would like to add that for intermediate financings, the responsibility for ensuring the sustainability of the underlying transactions across the three dimensions is delegated to the financial intermediary. The level of the proofing requirements will depend on the type of financing provided, potential type and risk level of the underlying transactions, and the type of final recipients. And let me say a few words also in order to conclude this presentation. There is not much of a conclusion after this, but I would say that this guidance materializes in practice the operation of the do no significant harm principle. It renders this principle operational. What does it mean concretely? There is a spillover effect to other instruments, and it secures a dovetailing with other instruments such as the Recovery and Resilience Facility, cohesion funding, Trans-European Networks funding. The technical screening criteria of the EU taxonomy will be streamlined through the guidance. Legal compliance related criteria will constitute a basis for granting InvestEU support. Do no significant harm elements which go beyond mere legal compliance to be considered as much as possible as basis for proposing mitigation measures. And with this, I will conclude my intervention. The guidance is supposed, and it announces this from the very beginning, is supposed to be a living document. Its requirements and its elements will be reviewed at midterm in order to see what has been the experience accumulated, what lessons can be drawn from this experience, and what adjustments are necessary. You can find links to the regulation and to the guidance in the last slide, indeed. And I hope it will prove a professionally instructive reading for everybody in the audience. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed, Errol. Raising the bar in some respects there, I would say, and also, yeah, very much ensuring that the environmental, climate and social dimensions are considered there. So let me now turn to Alistair from the EBRD. And Alistair, you're just going to quickly share with us some thoughts on what new elements you introduced when you updated your policy and performance requirements in 2019, right?
That's right.
Yep. Yeah, we're going through the same process ourselves at the EIB at the moment, so I'm very keen to hear what the challenges were for you, both during the review process itself and then when you've come to implement them over the last couple of years. So go ahead.
Well, I had a full set of hair before I started the policy revision, and now I have none. So that's probably a testament to how challenging this can be. First of all, just a few words about EBRD, and I'm just going to do a whistle-stop tour. EBRD is a true multilateral financial institution. We have 69 separate countries who are shareholders, plus the European Union and the European Investment Bank. So 71 owners. Each of them have views on policy. So we really straddle both the European context, and we are signatories to the European Principles on the Environment, and we use the environmental acquis, the body of EU legislation, to look at environmental issues. But we also make reference to the International Labour Organization for the core labour standards, And we're also quite influenced by one particular shareholder, which is the US government. The US government is the largest shareholder in EBRD and is the largest shareholder in most of the multilateral financial institutions. So their views on issues such as consultation are very strong. So that is the sort of the background in terms of the institutional context. And every 5 years, we are mandated to review the environmental and social policy. And it's quite a task to do it. And in our articles establishing the bank, it actually says that we will promote environmentally sound and sustainable development in all our activities. And that's quite a sort of a mouthful, but basically it says that we will have a strong environmental and social policy. So we implement that provision of the articles establishing the bank through our environmental and social policy. Next slide, please. So when reviewing the environmental and social policy, we're subject to different drivers. The first one is obviously we would look at the policy to look what needs strengthening, what needs clarifying. We also have had 5 years of the previous policy, which was established in 2014. So what did we find difficult to implement in terms of the language? Were the challenges what we call on the accountability side, and the initials there are project complaints mechanism, but it's essentially an independent accountability mechanism. And what new trends were there in development finance? So that's the second one. And then the third driver was actually listening to stakeholders. As I mentioned, we have 69 countries and the Commission, plus the EIB, all with strong views. But we also listen to academics, to other MFIs, to the public. And as part of the environmental social policy, we undertook the largest public consultation exercise on any policy or any strategy that we've ever undertaken. So that took place in 7 different countries in our countries of operation. Always a challenge to work, with the CSO community who are strongly have strong views that we have to take on board. Next slide, please. So just a quick summary of, of the first driver, what needed strengthening, what needed clarifying. Well, one thing that was in there in 2014, but we wanted to make sure that it was clarified, was the bank's commitments to respecting human rights on projects that it finances. Now, one thing that's challenging for a multilateral financial institution is that we can't necessarily sign up to perhaps UN declarations or conventions like the Aarhus one, but we can respect them. And that's because we're not a sovereign entity and we're not subject to the same rules. So we have our own rules that is agreed by our owners. So we make reference to it, we respect it, but it doesn't mean that we can necessarily sign up to it. We've also mainstreamed and strengthening the requirements to avoid and mitigate gender impacts. While this was a theme in 2014, our shareholders were very responsive to the considerations of the politicians at heart, and it was felt that we really needed to up the game to look at gender impacts. And if you were so minded and did a search for the word gender in our environmental and social policy, you'll find it in every single performance requirement. So it's a really strong mainstreaming of gender impact in the policy. Vulnerable people who are likely to be disproportionately affected, we've essentially done a better definition of who are vulnerable and the approaches that we would need to undertake to ensure that they were not disproportionately affected by projects. On the biodiversity side, I've said introduce ecosystem services concept, but essentially, we have strong biodiversity protections. This is one of the challenging areas with NGOs in that they will constantly want us to introduce something called a no-go situation. But the MFIs and EBRD are the same. we prefer to actually relate to actual specific conventions or concepts such as the Natura 2000 and put that into our definitions of areas which are, challenging for major developments to be put into. One thing that we're quite proud of, and I think we are the first MFI to put this in, was we introduced requirements relating to antimicrobial resistance. So these relate specifically to animal welfare projects, animal husbandry projects. We may be supporting a number of major agribusiness projects in our countries of operation. So antimicrobial resistance is one of the global threats, similar in a way to climate change, and of course strongly related to COVID-19. In obviously the increased infection rates, that also as a side effect of COVID means that the world is actually running out of antimicrobials, antibiotics is another word, and so we were very pleased to be part of this sort of trend to really identify this, and we are pushing other institutions as well to also include that. So Stephen, if you want something to put in, we would really appreciate something on antimicrobial resistance. And obviously consultation becomes a key issue. I want to go quite quickly, so if we can go to the next slide. So what did we learn? We learned a lot of things about, you would think that a project definition is the easiest thing in the world. Actually, when you look at banking operations, you might find a multiplicity of the definition of what a project actually is. Is it what we're financing? Does it include associated facilities that we may not be financing? Is it the section of road that's next to EIB's section of road that we are parallel financing? So the actual definitions of a project and where our standards apply is quite tricky. We've also learned about criteria for categorizing projects. We've slightly adjusted the EU list on that to make it easier. And then another emerging theme that came very quickly upon us and on the other institutions was a requirement to actually introduce issues such as gender-based violence and harassment policies. So we're doing a lot of work on that, including training of all our staff. But if you're out of any interest, other institutions, such as the World Bank, have really suffered on project implementation on this issue. And our shareholders are very sensitive about this issue. You only have to look at issues such as Oxfam and other institutions which have been hit by allegations. Two other things, human trafficking and modern slavery have become much bigger issues. It's hard to think, if you work in an institution, that you might have anything to do with modern slavery. But the issue of forced labour is not a simple one. It could be that contractors coming in or subcontractors coming in have passports that are being held centrally by the company employing them or by agents. And sometimes that actually crosses the line into forced labour in that sense. So those issues are things that we've learned is going on. How far do our requirements go down the supply chain? How much can we get leverage on the supply chain that we're not directly financing? And one thing that we learned was also that our Indigenous peoples requirements needed to be better aligned to EIB, ADB, World Bank, and other institutions, that we were slightly out of kilter on the definition of the Indigenous people requirements. Next slide. Stakeholder aspirations. Now, we actually went down a sort of a track in our policy revision process of taking out every single aspirational comment and statement, because we felt that because of accountability issues, that we were being held to account on aspirations and not on standards. And so compliance problems with it. It was quite controversial trying to take out anything of a an aspiration and just make it more of into a legal document. But our shareholders hated that. And so we went backwards, and in the sense of we went and then reintroduced aspirational statements and commitments, because our shareholders would not approve the policy unless we did. And so it does expose us for a continual challenge from accountability mechanisms, but we have to live with that. So sometimes you don't always get what you want. And as you see, those are some of the challenges. And I think, just jumping to some quick ones, the finance industry is moving very quickly into different ways of doing business. The bond market, sustainability bonds. And one of the things that we're faced now is capital market transactions, where there are specific rules about the involvement of financial institutions. We're subject to those rules. So it means that we can't always apply or have the time to fully apply policy. So we have to develop a risk-based approach. So this is a try it process. So we've introduced a risk-based requirement for capital market transactions, and we'll see how we get on. But part of that is also to make sure that any subcategories in the financial institutions, some of our intermediaries, those high risk or category A sub-projects have to be referred back to the bank. It's, you know, in the past we might have actually said, we've delegated that to the international financial institution, to the financial institution, but it's too risky. So we've had to bring that high risk projects back into some form of our own control. We've strengthened stakeholder engagement on all projects. If you want to know where you go wrong mostly on a project, it is on stakeholder engagement. So it's a very important aspect. And finally, the space for civil society, for the public, to complain about or to have a grievance about a project that EBRD or EIB or IFC or whoever are financing, that space is shrinking. They're subject to surveillance, they're subject to punitive laws, and it's becoming increasingly difficult, and they're being subject to harassment. So in response to that, we've put in specific provisions that stakeholder engagement and grievances have to be free from any form of retaliation by authorities and by our clients. So we've added those specifically and established internal procedures to try and manage this really challenging area. Next slide. Sorry, so I've now finished, and I think that's probably a good place for me to stop, is just to say good luck, EIB, in your policy revision process. Hopefully I've told you some of the challenges, and we're open for consultation for a small fee, and we'll let you know all the tricks later on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alistair. We'll be in touch. I mean, I should say that one of the objectives of us updating our policy and policy and standards is to harmonise us, you know, where we can with the other IFIs. So, you know, a lot of the issues that you've referred to there are issues that we ourselves are facing, and hopefully, you know, we'll get there in the end. I mean, I just wanted to ask you a very quick question, actually. To what extent do you think your 2019 update kind of preempted what has manifested itself through the taxonomy regulation with the minimum social safeguards and things? Do you think you're there, or do you think in your next update you'll be you know, assessing those again and making some changes?
I think we'll always be making changes, an update, particularly against any changes in EU. Taxonomy is an interesting one in the sense that I'm not sure whether we actually need to enshrine it within the environmental and social policy. That really covers the sustainability proofing already quite well, but it does influence the type of projects that we might be interested in financing and the way they're presenting it to our boards. Because similar to yourselves, we have a commitment to do sort of green financing. Over 50% of our investments by 2025 have to be what we call GET green economic transition projects. And we will be using EU taxonomy as part of those definitions very, very carefully.
Okay.
So it's a very important development for us in not just how we control projects, but how we identify and choose projects to invest in.
Okay, thank you very much. So next we have Eva from my office here at the EIB. Eva, in the recently adopted CBR, our Climate Bank Roadmap, the EIB committed to develop a more integrated sustainability policy framework. So you're going to tell us what that actually means and what it consists of. So over to you, Eva.
Thank you, Stephen. Next slide, Christina, please. All right, very similar also to the EBRD and our peer institutions. I mean, the EIB Environmental and Social Policy Framework has evolved over time to respond to the new and varied needs, not only of our clients, but of our stakeholders. In a world really that with new environmental, climate and social challenges, and we've also been trying to address the changing EU legal requirements, but also our own international and EU policy commitments. And those have been captured now also and clearly spelled out in our Climate Bank Roadmap. Our standards are oriented towards our clients and promoters and have been structured and designed to assist them in identifying and managing their environmental and social impacts and risk more effectively and efficiently, so that we ensure that EIB finance projects do no harm to the people and the environment affected by our project and our financing. And I think that is also part of the principle of the sustainability proofing, the underlying principles of sustainability proofing, but of all our MDB standards. So next slide, please. So with the adoption of the Climate Bank Roadmap, of which you have here at least the cover page, and EIB's commitment to support the EU Green Deal and the Commission's Action Plan for Financing Sustainable Growth, the EIB group this time, not only the EIB, but also the European Investment Fund, is in the process of revising its current environmental and social sustainability framework. And what the group has decided to do is to work within a sustainable finance framework. Can you, next slide, please? And I'll explain what that means. So basically, the structures of our framework is very similar to that of other MDB peers and as well as the EBRD. And so you start out with a group environmental and social policy framework, which really captures the group's, so in this case, EIB's and EIF's commitments, the principles to which it adheres to. And this is for us at the EIB framed within the EU treaties and the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. You then operationalize those commitments and those principles through sets of standards, and then also have for staff the internal EIB environmental and social due diligence procedures. The EIF has their own procedures, given the fact that the EIF works primarily with intermediated partners. So theirs are more structured towards financial intermediaries, whereas EIB finances both through intermediaries, but also direct investments. We then have our list of excluded activities, and what that means is looking at also taking into account our Paris alignment requirements, but also different environmental and social commitments that we have made. We will be also aligning our list of excluded activities, which also covers some of the no-go areas or the financing activities that we do not finance as an institution. Next slide, please. So these are the areas that we will be looking at in terms of the positive agenda. So what it requires and aligning our framework also and to the commitments of our Climate Bank roadmap requires, of course, a full integration of environmental, climate and social considerations across all our activities and processes. So it means, on the one hand, pursuing opportunities to generate benefits and positive environmental and social outcomes. And here you will see the different areas, key areas of EIB's environmental and social sustainability, where we are pursuing those positive outcomes, leveraging increased financing for those opportunities. Next slide, please. And then here we have our 10 environmental and social standards, and this is plus we will be looking at a new standard on financial intermediaries, which will consolidate our requirements for our clients in this space. And the standards really focus both on the management of environment, climate and social risks and impacts, as well as the reporting on those risks and impacts by our promoters and clients. But what does it mean in terms of assessing alignment and consistency with the EU taxonomy? So we have been looking at our current framework in light of the do no significant harm criteria that have been, for example, developed already for the 2 delegated acts that have been adopted for climate mitigation and adaptation. And what we have seen is actually that our environment, climate and social standards capture most of the criteria that have been spelt out for the do no significant harm aspects of the EU taxonomy. What is interesting to note is that the criteria, the do no significant harm criteria, is a combination not only of environmental and social standards, but also key criteria, sector criteria. So when we are carrying out our due diligence, we will be having to look at those criteria as part of our due diligence, because they refer really to sector specificities rather than general environmental and social impacts. With regards to the minimum social safeguards, those haven't yet been clearly spelt out under the EU taxonomy. That work is ongoing on that, but we feel confident that our social standards capture all the required elements and actually robust to actually address the minimum social safeguards that have been spelt out in the EU taxonomy. But what does it mean more generally, aligning with the EU taxonomy? It requires really a much better and effective mainstreaming of environment, climate and social considerations into our own decision-making process, not only at project level, but also at counterparty level. So next slide, please. So this is basically summarizes what we are trying to do with the revision of our new environmental and social sustainability framework. So there will be a much greater focus on outcomes and impacts so that we can deliver more effectively on the sustainable development goals. And it will be structured in such a way as to mirror the important parts of the EU and international efforts on sustainable finance, including the European Commission's Action Plan for Sustainable Growth as a key part of the EU Green Deal. But I think the focus that I would like to point out to is that development outcome focus, from being very prescriptive, which is the case of our current framework, to really taking a risk-based approach and focusing on the impacts and development outcomes. I will stop here and happy to answer any questions later on.
Sorry, just trying to find my mute button there. Okay, thank you very much indeed, Ava. Lots of work going on there. And finally, Well, let's just look into the mainstreaming issue now. And Joan, from your experience from DG INPA, as well as a consultant, perhaps you can tell us what the recent trends are in your view in the application of environmental and climate assessments in EU development cooperation, including in the context of the Green Deal, of course.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you for the invitation. So I'm gonna run you through quickly a bit what is the implications of this new policy scenario with the European Green Deal, and what does it mean for EU development cooperation, especially with regards to environmental assessment and more broadly to mainstreaming of environment and climate change. So go to the next slide. Yes, just a very quick reminder, but I think this fundamental reminder that the mainstreaming of environment is at the very core of EU policy. I mean, it is a requirement that it's inscribed in the treaty. So what we're doing is translating this requirement into the policy for development cooperation, as reflected in the European consensus on development, and then further down the line into operational tools. Next slide, please. Yes, you heard already a bit about the European Green Deal. It's one of the pillars of the new Commission. It's not the only one. However, there are a couple of things I would like to highlight here. First, the level of ambition of the European Green Deal. It really leads to an agenda that covers a wide range of sectors. I mean, it has implications really across the board, not only dealing with biodiversity, pollution, but also dealing with food production, dealing with the green and circular economy, etc. And also that it has an external dimension. So it is applicable to, of course, to the EU development cooperation. And an very important point is that it has a cross-cutting nature. So even though this is a pillar on its own in the priorities of the Commission, it also permeates into all the other pillars. So, for example, if we're working on digitalization, the principles of the European Green Deal need to be reflected in digitalization or any other of the other pillars as well. The European Green Deal refers to the Green Oath of doing no harm, and this would take to be a minimum. Of course, this is to be complemented with a positive agenda approach of seeking a transformational change. Next slide, please. Also, a reminder that the Green Deal is a central piece to green recovery. I think when a year ago, when we started with the lockdowns due to COVID-19, everyone was concerned whether this would just override this agenda on green development and sustainability due to other pressing concerns. But actually, it has been confirmed at the policy level that actually the Green Deal and the green transition is more important than ever under this new challenges that we are facing. So the recovery that we are seeking, and we are seeking to support also in developing countries through the development cooperation work, has to be a green recovery. So often there is talk about going back to normal, but we can't just go back to normal. We need to go back to a new normal, to a new, more sustainable and more resilient normal. Next slide, please. At the moment, DG INPA, for that matter, DG NEAR as well, are in the process of programming the development cooperation funds for the next MFF period, going from 2021 to 2027. And this is now mainly under a new instrument, which is the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument. This instrument groups other instruments that we used to have before, for example, the European Development Fund. And then, of course, there are a couple of other complementary instruments, such as, for example, on nuclear safety. And as well on IPA for the Western Balkans and the neighborhood, some of the neighborhood countries. Next slide, please. So under this NDICI instrument, what are the implications at an operational level when it comes down to impact assessment? So the NDICI regulation, which is for the time being a proposal, but we don't really expect any significant changes. It includes an article 25.5, that makes explicit reference to needing an environmental screening, including for climate change and biodiversity impacts, to be undertaken at the level of actions. And also, where relevant, strategic environmental assessments need to be implemented. So in a way, this points to the applicability of the EIA directive requirements. We also need to keep in mind that in development cooperation, we also need to be mindful of the national requirements for impact assessment, which of course are also applicable. And what happens in the case of blending, of blended finance, where the EU provides a grant component, a small grant component that allows large investments to be bankable, and bringing this additionality provided by the EU. In the case of blending projects, it is the environmental and social standards of the lead financial institution that are applicable. However, the EU has also a responsibility to make sure that these standards are compliant with the minimum EU requirements, and also be involved in their follow-up and implementation. Next slide, please. When it comes to this environmental screening referred to in the ICI requirements regulation, this provision in the regulation is actually a bit of a slightly reworded version of something that we had previously under the common implementing rules. When it comes to development cooperation for DG INPA, we have environmental guidelines that include an environment and climate risk screening. This screening, it's used to decide on whether a specific instrument needs to be implemented, such as a strategic environmental assessment, especially relevant for the case of budget support operations, an environmental impact assessment, or a climate risk assessment. Often the climate risk requirements are or should be integrated as part of the EIA. You may remember the EIA directive also covers the climate vulnerability of the projects. So this screening is actually going to be revised together with the whole of the guidelines for environment integration and climate change integration at the end of this year. And of course, they're going to be adapted to the new policy scenario, but they're also going to be integrating more directly other dimensions. So, for example, the disaster risk reduction dimension and the implications, for example, on the commitments in the context of the Sendai framework. However, not all of the projects, of course, of EU development cooperation require such dedicated tools. Actually, it's a few of our projects that require, for example, an EIA or a climate risk assessment. Of course, it's different when it comes to blending. We're talking about large investments, large infrastructure projects. But then again, as I said, here it is the safeguards of the lead financial institution that are applicable. But when it comes to the EU development cooperation grant projects, most of those do not require an EIA or an SEA or a climate risk assessment. And then we go to the next slide, please. But here we use what we like to call the green lenses approach. And this is really fundamental to the work that we do. So every single project needs to be designed, identified and designed from also an environmental sustainability, low carbon and climate resilient perspective. So, and this is one of the big changes recently, is acknowledging and operationalizing through tools the fact that we cannot just keep assessing impacts and try to identify the impacts on the environment and find ways to minimize and mitigate those impacts. That is the basic requirement that we are expecting. But we need to think about what projects are we proposing? How are we contributing to this positive agenda? And especially take a step back also towards strategic planning. So are we not only doing no harm, but are we actually doing more good through the type of projects that we are identifying and promoting? So yeah, thanks very much, and I leave it here for the time being.
Thanks very much indeed, Johan. I think you were ending there on the point about the positive agenda, which is what we're trying to bring out through our the update of our framework as well. We have less time than I'd hoped for the panel discussion, but maybe we can fit in a couple of quick questions. And maybe you can be brief in your answers. Maybe first to you, Aurel and Johan. I mean, we already cooperate between the Commission and the MDBs, ourselves and EBRD and others, for example. But how do you think, where do you see the opportunities really for better collaboration on climate, environment and social issues between the Commission and its DGs and the MDBs? Do you see there an obvious area where we can improve?
I would not now be able to comment on a specific area, but based on the past experience that we had with the EIB and thinking about a number of projects where we had more debates about how to make sure that the environmental dimension in particular is taken into account, I look forward really to a closer cooperation between the EIB colleagues and the Commission colleagues, and not only the colleagues in charge, which are traditionally representing the Commission, which is the department in charge of economic and financial affairs, but also we are open as a department in charge of environmental policy to co-exchange directly with you. Mm-hmm. I would put it on a daily basis. I hope you don't need that. We don't need that on a daily basis, but I think close contact would be very useful in order to align the minds and to provide consistency of message and operations. And I'm not speaking on behalf of the department in charge of climate change, but I am fairly certain that they would look forward to that as well, and they would be ready to work closer with you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I would second that very strongly. Johan, do you have any thoughts on that particular point?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, when it comes to blended finance, we have to remember this is relatively new to the Commission, and and things have been evolving in the way, for example, the EU delegations are approaching or getting involved in blended finance. And I think there are opportunities to have established a closer collaboration, for example, in the setting of the project pipelines. So I think in the past we tended to be more reactive. And now the tendency is to be more proactive and establish a closer collaboration to really work together with the financial institutions in identifying these projects, in deciding how to move them forward. And this also opens opportunities for example, EU delegations to seek what are the synergies that they can establish between these investments with their bilateral cooperation. So I think there are plenty of opportunities here, really to work closer, also to understand better the environmental and social standards and safeguards of the financial institutions. With some, I think they're well known and we are very comfortable with them. For example, EIB, EBRD, but others are probably less known to us. So we need to also I think that's also a bit of homework for the Commission and the delegations to understand better what are these standards and how they fit with the EU requirements, and how we can engage in a more meaningful and constructive manner in the process.
Okay, I would certainly agree with that. Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Alistair and Eva, I wonder if I might go slightly off-piste with you. I'm really interested in your views on the recent Dasgupta review. I mean, that is essentially saying that the planet has reached a tipping point, that our demands on nature now, far exceed its capacity to supply. And that as a measure of economic activity, the traditional GDP measure just doesn't really account for the depreciation of assets properly, and that includes the natural environment. So, I mean, what is it, do you think, that the financial institutions can do there to move this forward and to help address this and to bring about the kind of fundamental change that Dasgupta is suggesting? Maybe Alistair first, and then Eva.
It's not an easy question. I mean, the way we are looking at all these issues now, these global threats, is that first of all, we have an eminent scientist, economist, to what's the implications for the world if we do nothing. So first we had Nick Stern's report, then we had Jim O'Neill on AMR, and now Professor Dasgupta's on sort of natural capital. And I think these are really seminal pieces of work that really influence policies about how we should view what our role is as multilateral financial institutions. Our owners are very, they set the strategic directions. And certainly, for the next 5 years, we are very much driven, and we've included that ability to work more in the natural capital world to try and not only protect, but enhance biodiversity issues. And I think the role of an MFI is really important. So, if EIB and EBRD and the World Bank, we start integrating these concerns into projects, it's all part of the system by which we can catalyze financial flows. And if I think back to climate, I think we can pat ourselves on the back that the IFI community have probably put together about 50 billion of capital into climate change mitigation or resilience adaptation. But there's a drop in the ocean of what is needed. We really need the private sector, because no government, no MFI has enough capital to do it on our own. So we need the whole of the financial institution. They're the only ones. We need the whole sector to be involved, and that's the only way that you can make these structural changes, whether it's climate, biodiversity, the natural capital framework, blue economy. I think these are all sort of, we're learning as we're doing, and I think climate is probably in the lead, but we see the interlinks now into the influence of climate on biodiversity as well as a really strong driver. So I could see all this sort of coming together in the future as a major theme for us. Eva?
Yes, just to complement what Alistair has said, I do see a role for the MDBs because often when the MDBs do engage in one environment, it does have repercussions on the financial sector, but also on the private sector. And I'll give you an example. I think we set the bar, as Alistair said, we have both institutions have very robust standards in terms of biodiversity. And IFC was the first one that led us down that path, really. But it had really a knock-on effect on, first of all, on the extractives that really raised their ambition and raised their standards. And I think then it just it trickles to all the other sectors, and that is the catalytic role that we do have as an MDB, certainly in setting standards, but also integrating these externalities. We all do a form of economic appraisal. So if we start including those externalities into our economic appraisal, and that becomes part of our decision-making process, it will make our promoters and clients think twice about the impact on biodiversity and natural capital, but also, as Alice had said, I mean, it needs to be mainstreamed across all economic sectors.
Okay, thank you very much, Eva. And then just one very final quick-fire question, maybe a couple of keywords back from each of you, if I may. I'm going back to the overarching theme of the conference, which is actually about smartening impact assessment in challenging times. I mean, what is your interpretation in a single sentence of what does that mean? What does smartening mean for you? Interested to hear. Maybe Arul, we can start with you. One sentence, please.
It's a very difficult thing, but really making the best use of the information which is made available through the environmental impact assessment and focusing effectively on biodiversity, water, air, the components of natural capital. So pulling everything together in order to get an even clearer picture and a more simplified picture that gives the investor the necessary information in order to make a good decision.
Okay, thank you very much. Quickly to you, Joan.
Yep. Thanks. No, I think smartening is really about efficiency. And it's in the case of impact assessment, I think it's also about recognizing that impact assessment, doesn't live on its own. It's part of an ecosystem where policies are really drivers, and recognizing that there's this link, and that we cannot just focus on identifying impacts and preparing mitigation measures. That we need to really take a step back and think and set the ground to really promote this positive agenda, promote this transformational change that we need through policy. And then if we get the strategic planning dimension right, and we identify the right projects, we will then be able to have a more efficient impact assessment process, really focusing on the essentials.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually going to skip over Alistair and Eva there because we don't have time. Saved by the bell. I mean, just by way of a summary, and then we can close. I mean, I think we owe it to ourselves probably more than ever now to make sure that we have robust and deep and meaningful, if you like, environmental, climate and social policies and standards in place. And some of the key words I take away from this discussion are integration. So make sure that we very much keep the three areas in focus, and we develop the links between them. They are inextricably linked in so many different ways, and I'm not really sure that that's well understood. So we need to keep bringing that out. And then harmonization. We need to make sure that we develop all these things en masse so that we're not all kind of trying to do things slightly differently. And as Arul and Joanne said there very eloquently, communication. We need to keep communicating with each other. And maybe not on a daily basis, as was suggested there, but certainly regularly, probably much more regularly than we do now. And so thank you very much indeed for your time and your contribution. I think it's been a very useful discussion. And I look forward to continuing discussion on the IAA chat platform. And for all of those who are watching, thank you very much for your interest. And if you have any questions or comments, you know where to go. And we would also encourage you just before leaving to check out the other sessions on the European Forum, as I mentioned earlier. Our next session digs deeper into the Sustainable Finance Action Plan and key aspects for IFIs impact assessment practitioners. And then that's followed by a session on best practices in implementing sustainable finance and a final session on the emerging issues in ESG risk management, which percolates across everything that we do now and going forward. So thank you very much indeed for your time, and cheerio, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.